Sometimes the hardest part of being a nurse isn't the long hours or difficult patients. It's watching people you care about slip away, knowing you've done everything you can. After 40 years of healing others, 62-year-old Marianne Porter thought her biggest challenge was simply making it to retirement. Then Harold Edmonds, an old friend from high school, walked into her clinic with what looked like a simple rash. She was ready to send him home with cream and kind words. But when she looked closer at his arm, her heart stopped. The pattern was unmistakable, the same rare condition that had taken her husband 20 years ago. This time she knew exactly what she was looking at. This time, she might actually be able to save someone. Could she find the courage to face her deepest regret and give Harold the chance her husband never had? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the dusty Venetian blinds of Millbrook Community Clinic, casting familiar stripes across the worn linoleum floor that Marianne Porter had walked for nearly 4 decades. At 62, she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen every possible ailment that could walk through those glass doors, yet her steps carried a weariness that hadn't been there in her younger years. "Morning, Marianne," Betty Kowalski called from behind the reception desk, her voice carrying the comfortable familiarity of 23 years working together. Betty was pushing 70, but refused to consider retirement, claiming the clinic needed her more than her garden did. "Mrs. Henderson's here early for her blood pressure check, and that new patient, Harold something, called to confirm his..." In 2 o'clock, Marianne paused at the coffee pot, the same dented aluminum percolator that had been brewing bitter coffee since the Clinton administration. The mention of Harold's name stirred something in her chest, though she couldn't quite place. Why? Edmonds. Harold Edmonds. The name floated in her memory like a half-remembered song. "Harold Edmonds?" she asked, pouring coffee into her favorite mug, the one with a faded cartoon nurse that her late husband Robert had given her on their 15th wedding anniversary. "That's the one. Said he went to high school with you." Betty shuffled through appointment cards with hands that showed the arthritis she never complained about. "Seemed like a nice man. Polite. Said he had some kind of rash he wanted you to look at. High school." Marianne's mind drifted back to 1978, to Millbrook High School, where the graduating class had been exactly 47 students. Everyone had known everyone then, their lives intertwined like the threads of an old quilt. Harold Edmonds, tall, quiet, played basketball until he broke his ankle junior year. He'd sat 2 rows behind her in Mrs. Patterson's English class, occasionally borrowing her notes when he'd missed school, helping his father with the family farm. "Dr. Chen's already in," Betty continued, oblivious to Marianne's momentary journey into the past. "Got here at 7:30. That girl works too hard." Dr. Sarah Chen had joined the clinic 18 months ago, fresh from her residency at the University Hospital in Cedar Rapids. At 31, she carried the idealistic energy that Marianne remembered having once, the belief that every patient could be saved, every condition could be treated, every family could find hope. Marianne both envied and worried about that optimism. The clinic had been Marianne's second home since 1985, when she'd started as a young mother, trying to balance raising her daughter Lisa with building a career. Back then, old Dr. Morrison had run the place with gentle authority, teaching her that medicine was as much about listening as it was about diagnosing. The building itself hadn't changed much. Still the same pale green walls, the same creaking floorboards in the back hallway, the same slightly musty smell that spoke of decades of caring for this small farming community. Millbrook, Iowa. Population 3,847 was the kind of place where 3 generations of the same family might occupy the same church pew every Sunday, where the high school football games drew half the town on Friday nights, and where everyone knew not just your name, but your grandmother's maiden name and which farm your great-grandfather had homesteaded. Marianne had been born here, had married here, had buried her husband here, and had planned to retire here. Robert, even now, 20 years after his death, thinking his name was like pressing on a barely healed wound. They'd met at Iowa State, where she'd been studying nursing and he'd been pursuing agricultural engineering. He'd been drawn to her quiet competence, she to his gentle humor and steady presence. They'd returned to Millbrook after graduation, Robert taking over the family farm from his aging father. Marianne starting work at the clinic. For 15 years, life had unfolded with predictable rhythms. Robert's concerns about corn futures and rainfall, her stories about difficult patients and medical mysteries, their shared dreams of travel, and grandchildren when their daughter Lisa found the right man. They'd saved money in a coffee can hidden behind the flour canister, planning for a cruise to Alaska when Robert turned 55. Then came the rash. It had started innocuously, a small patch of discolored skin on Robert's forearm that he'd attributed to a reaction to some new herbicide. Probably nothing, he'd said, the way farmers always did about their own health, saving their worry for their crops and livestock. But Marianne had learned to trust her instincts, and something about that rash had troubled her from the beginning. The dermatologist in Cedar Rapids had been puzzled. The pattern wasn't quite eczema, wasn't quite psoriasis, wasn't quite anything he'd seen in his textbooks. Blood work came back with subtle abnormalities, elevated inflammatory markers, slightly depressed immune function. More specialists, more tests, more questions with fewer answers. By the time they'd identified the rare autoimmune condition, a genetic disorder so uncommon it didn't even have a proper name, just a string of medical terminology that translated roughly to "the body attacks itself in unpredictable ways." Robert had grown thin and tired, his farmer's strength sapped by an enemy he couldn't plow under or irrigate away. Marianne had taken leave from the clinic to care for him, transforming their bedroom into a makeshift medical facility. She'd administered medications, monitored symptoms, consulted with specialists across the Midwest. Her nursing training had never felt more important or more inadequate. She knew enough to understand how serious his condition was, but not enough to fix it. He died on a Tuesday morning in March, with snow still covering the fields he'd loved. Marianne had been holding his hand, had felt the exact moment when his pulse grew weak and then stopped. 43 years old, gone because of a rash that had looked like nothing. The grief had nearly broken her. Lisa, away at college, had wanted her mother to move to Chicago, start fresh, escape the memories that seemed to lurk in every corner of their farmhouse. But Marianne couldn't leave. This was where Robert was buried, where their life together made sense, where her work still mattered. She'd returned to the clinic 6 months later, throwing herself into patient care with a devotion that concerned her friends and colleagues. Over the years, that intensity had gradually evolved into the steady professionalism that now defined her. She'd helped deliver babies who were now graduating high school, had held the hands of elderly patients as they passed, had become the person families called when they needed someone who understood both medicine and heartbreak. "Marianne," Dr. Chen's voice broke through her reverie. The younger woman stood in the doorway of the break room, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her white coat still crisp despite the early hour. "I wanted to go over the schedule before. Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." Marianne realized she'd been standing motionless for several minutes, her coffee growing cold in her hands, her mind lost in memories she usually kept carefully contained. "I'm fine. Just thinking about an old friend who's coming in today. Harold Edmonds. Betty mentioned you went to school together." Sarah's expression softened with the kind of curiosity that spoke of genuine care rather than nosiness. "It's nice when you get to reconnect with people from your past." "Sometimes," Marianne said, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. Change was difficult at 62, especially when your life had found a comfortable, if somewhat lonely, rhythm. Old friends brought old memories, and memories had a way of disrupting carefully maintained equilibrium. The morning passed in its usual pattern. Mrs. Henderson's blood pressure was slightly elevated, requiring a gentle lecture about reducing her sodium intake. Tommy Brennan, age 7, had managed to get a bead from his sister's craft set stuck in his ear, requiring careful extraction and a stern warning about the dangers of putting small objects where they didn't belong. Mr. Kowalski had come in for his quarterly diabetes check, his numbers stable thanks to his wife's vigilant menu planning, routine cases, familiar faces, the kind of steady medical practice that had sustained her through 2 decades of widowhood. Each patient represented not just a medical problem to be solved, but a thread in the fabric of community life that she'd helped weave and maintain. As lunchtime approached, Marianne found herself growing unaccountably nervous about Harold's appointment. She'd looked up his file, 44 years old, no major medical history. Last visit had been for a tetanus shot 3 years ago after a farming accident. The rash he'd described over the phone sounded minor, the kind of thing that usually required nothing more than a topical cream and reassurance. So why did the thought of seeing him again make her hands slightly unsteady as she prepared for the afternoon? The call came at 7:30 Thursday morning, just as Marianne was settling into her office with her first cup of coffee. Betty's voice carried an unusual tension that made Marianne's stomach clench before she even heard the words. Lab called. With Harold Edmonds' results. They want to speak with you directly. Marianne's hand tightened around her coffee mug. In 40 years of nursing, she'd learned that labs didn't call directly unless the results were either drastically abnormal or required immediate attention. Neither possibility boded well. Put them through, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The lab technician's voice was professionally neutral, but Marianne could read between the lines. Elevated inflammatory markers, specifically C-reactive protein levels 3 times. Normal range. White blood cell count showing signs of immune system activation. Most telling of all, the autoimmune panel revealed antibodies that shouldn't have been present in a healthy 44-year-old farmer. We've flagged these for physician review, the technician concluded. Will Dr. Chen be following up? I'll handle the follow-up, Marianne said, already reaching for Harold's file. Thank you. She sat motionless for several minutes after ending the call, staring at the numbers she'd scribbled on Harold's chart. The values were eerily similar to Robert's initial blood work, not identical, but close enough to confirm what she'd feared since the moment she'd seen that distinctive rash pattern. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the phone to call Harold, then stopped. This wasn't a conversation to have over the telephone, not when she was about to potentially upend someone's life with a few carefully chosen words. Instead, she walked to the storage closet, where old patient files were. Captain pulled out a box she hadn't opened in years. Robert Porter's medical records were there, maintained long past the required retention period because she couldn't bring herself to destroy them. She spread them across her desk next to Harold's recent results, comparing values with the methodical precision that had made her one of the most trusted nurses in the county. The parallels were undeniable. Robert's C-reactive protein had been 8.2 mg/L at first diagnosis. Harold's was 8.7. Robert's lymphocyte count had shown the same subtle abnormalities. Even the skin biopsy report from Robert's case described tissue changes that matched exactly what she'd observed on Harold's arm. Marianne. Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway, holding a cup of tea and looking concerned. Betty said the lab called about your high school friend. Everything okay? Marianne looked up from the scattered papers, realizing she must look as shaken as she felt. Sarah Chen was a good doctor. Thorough, compassionate, willing to listen to the insights of experienced nurses. If anyone would understand the gravity of what Marianne had discovered, it would be her. Could you close the door? Marianne asked. I need to show you something. Sarah settled into the chair across from Marianne's desk, her expression growing more serious as she took in the medical records spread between them. These are 2 different patients, she observed, noting the different names at the top of each chart. Harold Edmonds and my late husband Robert, Marianne confirmed. Look at the blood work. Sarah leaned forward, her medical training immediately, recognizing the significance of the similar values. These are nearly identical results. What was your husband's diagnosis? Systemic autoimmune inflammatory syndrome. Extremely rare, maybe 1 in 2 million people. It took 6 months and consultations with specialists in 3 states before anyone could even put a name to it. And the prognosis. Marianne was quiet for a long moment, remembering the day Dr. Hendricks at the University of Iowa had finally explained what Robert was facing. 18 months, typically, maybe 2 years with aggressive treatment. Sarah studied the papers more closely, her expression growing grave. You think Harold has the same condition? I think Harold has exactly the same condition, Marianne said. The rash pattern, the blood work, even the initial symptoms, fatigue, joint pain. It's identical to what Robert experienced. But surely there have been advances in treatment since. When did your husband pass? 20 years ago. And yes, there have been some advances, new immunosuppressive protocols, better supportive care, but the fundamental problem remains the same. It's a genetic condition that causes the immune system to attack healthy tissue. There's no cure. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. What do you want to do? It was exactly the right question, not what should be done, not what protocol demanded, but what Marianne wanted, what her experience and intuition told her was best for Harold. I want him to see Dr. Hendricks at University of Iowa, Marianne said. He's the specialist who treated Robert, and if anyone can confirm this diagnosis quickly, it's him. But first, I need to prepare Harold for what we might be looking at. That's going to be a difficult conversation. Yes, Marianne agreed. It is. Harold arrived at 2 o'clock, as scheduled, looking optimistic in the way people do when they assume medical follow-ups will bring good news. He'd clearly made an effort to dress nicely, clean jeans, a pressed shirt, boots that had been recently polished. It struck Marianne that he might have thought of this as partially a social visit, a chance to reconnect with an old friend. So what's the verdict? He asked cheerfully, as he settled into the chair beside her desk. Am I going to live? The casual question hit Marianne like a physical blow. She'd spent years learning how to deliver difficult news to patients, but this felt different, personal. The weight of her own loss made every word feel loaded with significance. Harold, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is preliminary, she began carefully. We'll need more tests, consultations with specialists to be completely certain. His expression grew more serious as he registered her tone. Okay, what did the blood work show? Some abnormalities that concern me. Your inflammatory markers are elevated, and there are signs that your immune system is more active than it should be. Harold absorbed this information with the stoic practicality of a man who'd spent his life dealing with unpredictable weather and market prices. What does that mean exactly? Marianne reached for her desk drawer and pulled out her high school yearbook, the artifact she'd retrieved from home the night before. She turned to a page near the back, to the candid photos from senior year activities. There they were, Harold and Marianne at the spring dance, both looking impossibly young and optimistic about their futures. Do you remember this? She asked, showing him the photograph. Harold smiled despite his obvious concern. Spring formal, 1978. You wore that blue dress, and I stepped on your feet during the slow songs. You were a terrible dancer, Marianne agreed, and for a moment they both smiled at the memory. Then she grew serious again. Harold, I'm showing you this because I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you isn't just coming from your nurse. It's coming from someone who's known you for 44 years and cares about what happens to you. Harold's smile faded completely. You're scaring me, Marianne. The pattern of abnormalities in your blood work is very similar to something I've seen before. In my husband, Robert. What kind of condition are we talking about? Marianne had rehearsed this conversation in her mind, but now that the moment had arrived, all her careful preparations seemed inadequate. It's called systemic autoimmune inflammatory syndrome. It's very rare. How rare? 1 in 2 million. Harold was quiet for a long moment, staring at the yearbook photo of their younger selves. And what happened to Robert? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with all the implications Harold was beginning to understand. Marianne had learned over the years that sometimes the kindest approach was absolute honesty, delivered with compassion, but without false hope. Robert lived for 18 months after his diagnosis, she said quietly. But Harold, that was 20 years ago. Treatment options have improved. If this is what you have, and we don't know for certain yet, we're going to fight it with everything available. Harold nodded slowly, his farmer's pragmatism asserting itself. What do we need to do? The simple question, asked with quiet courage, nearly undid her. This was why she'd gone into nursing in the first place. For moments like this, when someone faced the unthinkable with dignity and asked not why me, but what next. I want you to see a specialist at the University of Iowa. Dr. Hendricks. He treated Robert, and he's one of the leading experts in rare autoimmune conditions. I can call today and try to get you an appointment next week. And in the meantime, we monitor your symptoms carefully. Any new rashes, increased fatigue, joint pain. I want to know about it immediately. And Harold? She reached across the desk and touched his hand briefly. You're not alone in this. Whatever it turns out to be, we're going to face it together. For the first time since she'd begun explaining the situation, Harold's composure wavered slightly. I appreciate that, Marianne. More than you know. After Harold left, Marianne sat in her office holding the yearbook, studying the photograph of their younger selves. They'd been so certain then that life would unfold predictably. Marriage, children, careers, retirement, grandchildren. Neither of them could have imagined that 44 years... That evening, Marianne sat at her kitchen table with Robert's wedding ring in her palm, the thin gold band catching the light from the overhead fixture. She'd worn it on a chain around her neck for 20 years, hidden beneath her scrubs like a talisman against forgetting. Now, as she prepared to make the phone call that might save Harold's life, she found herself touching it for strength. Dr. Marcus Hendricks answered his direct line on the second ring, his voice carrying the same measured authority she remembered from 2 decades ago. At 73, he was supposedly semi-retired, but Marianne knew he still consulted on the most complex cases that came through the University of Iowa's medical center. Dr. Hendricks, this is Marianne Porter. You treated my husband Robert about 20 years ago for SAIS. There was a pause, and she could almost hear him searching his memory. Mrs. Porter, yes. Robert was a challenging case. I'm sorry we weren't able to do more for him. You did everything possible, Marianne said, meaning it. I'm calling because I believe I have another patient with the same condition. The presentation is remarkably similar. She described Harold's symptoms and blood work in precise medical terminology, her nursing training allowing her to communicate with the specialist as a colleague rather than a worried family member. Doctor, Hendricks asked detailed questions about the rash pattern, the timeline of symptoms, Harold's family history. I can see him Monday at 2 o'clock, Dr. Hendricks said finally. But Mrs. Porter, I have to ask, are you certain you're being objective about this case, given your personal history with the condition? The question stung, but Marianne recognized its necessity. Medical professionals weren't immune to seeing patterns where none existed, especially when grief and guilt were involved. I've considered that possibility, she admitted, but the blood work doesn't lie. His inflammatory markers are nearly identical. To Robert's were at first presentation, then we'd better see him as soon as possible. If you're right, time is crucial. After ending the call, Marianne made herself a cup of tea and sat down with Robert's medical journal, turning to the entries from his early diagnosis. His handwriting in those first weeks had been optimistic, almost clinical in its detachment. Day 18. Saw Dr. Hendricks today. Nice man, very thorough. He's ordering more tests but seems confident they'll figure this out. Marianne is more worried than I am, but that's just her nature. always borrowing trouble before it arrives. How wrong he'd been about her capacity for worry. If anything, she'd been too optimistic in those early days, too confident that modern medicine could fix whatever was wrong with her husband. It wasn't until much later that she'd understood how rare Robert's condition was, how few doctors had ever seen it, how limited the treatment options were. The next morning brought unseasonably warm weather for October, the kind of false spring that made farmers nervous and reminded everyone that Iowa weather followed no predictable patterns. Marianne arrived at the clinic to find Dr. Chen already reviewing patient files for the day. "How did Harold take the news yesterday?" Sarah asked, looking up from her paperwork. "Better than I expected. He's seeing Dr. Hendricks on Monday." Marianne poured herself coffee, noting that her hands were steadier than they'd been the day before. Having a plan, even a preliminary one, always helped. "I did some reading last night about systemic autoimmune inflammatory syndrome," Sarah said carefully. "The literature is pretty grim. The literature reflects cases from 10 and 20 years ago. Treatment has improved." Has it really, though? Or is that what we tell ourselves to make difficult conversations easier? The question hung between them, and Marianne recognized the younger doctor's struggle with medical helplessness, that terrible moment when training and technology weren't enough, when all the years of education collided with the reality of human limitation. "Both, probably," Marianne said honestly, "but hope isn't the same thing as false reassurance. Harold deserves to know that people are fighting for him, even if we can't promise him a cure." Their conversation was interrupted by Betty's voice. Over the intercom, "Marianne, Harold Edmonds is on line 2, says it's important." Marianne's stomach clenched as she reached for the phone. Important calls from patients were rarely good news. "Harold, what's wrong?" "The rash has spread overnight." His voice was calm, but she could hear the underlying tension. "It's moved up my arm, and there's a new patch on my chest. Can you come in this morning? I know you're not scheduled until next week, but I'm already in the parking lot." When Harold entered exam room 15 minutes later, Marianne could see immediately that something fundamental had changed. The rash on his left arm had indeed spread, creating an irregular pattern that extended from his wrist nearly to his elbow. More concerning was the new lesion on his chest, a circular patch about 2 inches in diameter that showed the same mottled coloration she'd observed on his arm. "When did you first notice the chest lesion?" she asked, pulling on gloves. "To examine the new area. This morning when I was getting dressed. It wasn't there yesterday." Harold sat still as she palpated the affected area, his farmer's stoicism evident in the way he accepted the examination without flinching. The skin felt different, not just the texture changes she'd noted before, but a subtle firmness that suggested deeper tissue involvement. Marianne had felt something similar under her fingertips 20 years ago, had learned to recognize it as a sign that the condition was progressing from superficial skin changes to systemic involvement. "I'm going to call Dr. Hendricks and see if he can see you earlier," she said, stepping back from the examination table. "It's spreading fast, isn't it?" Harold asked quietly. Marianne met his eyes directly. "Yes, faster than I'd like." How fast did it spread with Robert? The question was asked without drama or self-pity, but it cut straight to the heart of what they were both thinking. Harold deserved honesty, especially now. With Robert, the progression was gradual at first, then accelerated. But Harold, every case is different. Your body isn't Robert's body. Harold nodded thoughtfully. "My daughter Jennifer is driving up from Des Moines this weekend. I haven't told her about any of this yet." "What are you going to say?" "The truth, I suppose. She's a nurse practitioner. She'll understand the medical aspects better than most." He paused, looking down at his hands. "Her mother died when Jennifer was 12. Cancer. I don't want her to think she's going to lose another parent, but I won't lie to her either." The mention of Harold's late wife surprised Marianne. She'd known about the cancer. In a town like Millbrook, major illnesses were community events, but she hadn't realized Harold was facing this alone, without a spouse to share the burden. "How long have you been widowed?" she asked gently. 15 years this December. Ellen was 41 when she died. Harold's voice carried the familiar weight of old grief. "Strange how life brings you full circle sometimes. Back then, you helped me understand what the doctors were telling us about Ellen's condition. Now here we are again." Marianne felt a flutter of memory, visiting Harold and Ellen at the hospital during Ellen's final weeks, explaining medical terminology, helping them navigate the complex world of oncology treatments. She'd forgotten that connection, how their lives had intersected during another medical crisis. "We got through it then," she said. "We'll get through this now, together," Harold agreed. And for the first time since entering the clinic, he smiled, slightly. After Harold left with an appointment moved up to Friday morning with Dr. Hendricks, Marianne found herself standing at the window of the break room, looking out at the main street of Millbrook. The town looked exactly as it had for decades. The same storefronts, the same tree-lined streets, the same sense of permanence that had drawn her back after college and kept her here through marriage, widowhood, and the slow accumulation of years. But beneath that surface stability, lives were changing in ways that couldn't be seen from the street. Harold was facing a diagnosis that might cut his life short. His daughter was about to learn that her remaining parent was seriously ill, and Marianne was being forced to confront not only her professional limitations, but the unhealed grief that 20 years hadn't diminished as much as she'd pretended. The wedding ring beneath her scrubs felt heavier than usual, as if Robert's memory was pressing closer, demanding that she not fail this time the way she'd failed before. Friday morning arrived grey and drizzly, the kind of weather that made bones ache and reminded everyone that winter was approaching. Marianne had offered to drive Harold to Iowa City for his appointment with Dr. Hendricks, but he'd insisted on driving himself, a gesture of independence that she recognized from her own experience with serious illness. Sometimes maintaining control over small decisions became crucial when larger forces were spinning beyond reach. She spent the morning distracted, checking her phone every few minutes for updates that wouldn't come for hours. Dr. Chen noticed her agitation during their 10 o'clock staff meeting. "Why don't you take the afternoon off?" Sarah suggested, after they'd finished reviewing the week's patient load. "You've been here every day for 3 months straight. Betty and I can handle things." "I'd rather stay busy," Marianne replied, but even as she said it, she knew Sarah was right. Her mind wasn't fully present today, and patients deserved better than a nurse whose attention was divided between their needs and her worry about a friend facing a life-altering diagnosis 90 miles away. At noon, she found herself driving not toward home, but toward the old Porter farm where she'd lived. With Robert, she hadn't been back in over a year, not since the current owners had asked her to look through the barn for any belongings the previous estate sale might have missed. The farmhouse looked well-maintained, painted a cheerful yellow instead of the white she and Robert had chosen. New owners had planted flowers where she'd once grown vegetables, had installed a swing set where Robert's workshop used to stand. It was still beautiful, but it was no longer theirs, which was exactly as it should be, she reminded herself. Houses needed families to fill them with purpose. She parked at the edge of the gravel drive and walked to the small family cemetery that occupied a corner of what had once been the south pasture. Robert's headstone was simple grey granite, engraved with his name, dates, and the words she'd chosen. "Beloved husband and father, he made the land bloom." "I need to tell you about Harold," she said aloud, feeling only slightly foolish for talking to a granite marker. "He's sick, Robert, the same thing you had." The wind rustled through the corn stubble beyond the cemetery fence, but provided no answers to the questions that had been troubling her since Harold's diagnosis. Why had she survived 20 years of widowhood, only to face this again? Why did life seem determined to test the same wounds repeatedly? "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted to the silence. "I couldn't save you, and I don't know how to save him." Her phone buzzed with a text message. "Harold, appointment done, can we talk?" She typed back quickly, "On my way to your house." Harold lived in a modest ranch-style home on the outskirts of Millbrook, the kind of practical dwelling that reflected a man who valued function over form. The yard was meticulously maintained, the driveway free of weeds, the storm windows already installed for winter, all evidence of someone who took care of what belonged to him. He answered the door before she could knock, his face carrying the particular exhaustion that came from spending hours in medical facilities, submitting to tests and examinations that reduced a person to symptoms and data points. "How did it go?" she asked, as he led her to his kitchen table, where papers from his appointment were spread in neat stacks. "Dr. Hendricks confirmed your diagnosis," Harold said without preamble. "Systemic autoimmune inflammatory syndrome. He said the presentation is textbook, if there were textbooks about something this rare." Marianne sat down heavily in the chair. Across from him, part of her having hoped she'd been wrong, that her grief-influenced perception had made connections that didn't actually exist. "What else did he say?" Harold picked up a pamphlet with the University of Iowa Medical Center logo. "There's a new treatment protocol they've been testing, combination immunosuppressive therapy with some experimental components. It's not a cure, but it might slow the progression significantly." "That's more than we had 20 years ago," Marianne said, trying to inject hope into her voice. "Maybe. The side effects sound brutal. Increased infection risk, potential organ damage, quality of life issues, and there's no guarantee it will work." Harold set the pamphlet aside and looked directly at her. "He also told me that the average survival time is still 18 to 24 months, even with treatment." The clinical language couldn't mask the reality they were discussing. Marianne reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, noting how familiar the gesture felt despite the decades that had passed since they'd been more than casual acquaintances. "What did you decide about the treatment?" "I start Monday. Dr. Hendricks wants to be aggressive early. Try to slow the progression before it affects major organs." Harold turned his hand palm up beneath hers, squeezing gently. "Jennifer drove up last night. I told her everything." "How did she take it?" "Better than I expected. She's a professional. She understands the medical realities, but she's also my daughter, so she's scared." Harold paused, looking out his kitchen window toward the fields beyond his backyard. "She wants to move back to Millbrook, help take care of me." I told her absolutely not. "Why?" "She's got a good job at the medical center in Des Moines, a boyfriend she's serious about, a life she's built. I won't let this disease destroy her future, along with mine." Marianne understood his reasoning, but she also recognized the stubborn independence that could become isolation if carried too far. "Harold, accepting help isn't the same as giving up. I know that, but there's a difference between accepting help and letting someone sacrifice their life because you're dying." The blunt statement hung between them, acknowledging the reality. They'd been dancing around since his diagnosis. Harold was facing a terminal illness, and all their medical consultations and treatment protocols wouldn't change that fundamental fact. "You're not dying yet," Marianne said firmly. "You're living with a serious condition, but you're still living. For now. For now is all any of us have, Harold. It was true before your diagnosis, and it's true now." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the late afternoon light fade across his backyard. Finally, Harold spoke again. "Dr. Hendricks asked if I had a primary care team I trusted to coordinate my treatment here in Millbrook. I told him I had the best nurse in Iowa looking after me. Harold, I know it's asking a lot. I know this brings up difficult memories for you, but I also know that if anyone can help me navigate what's coming, it's you." Marianne thought about Robert's final months, about the weight of being both caregiver and witness to deterioration, about the way love and medical knowledge combined to create a burden that was both privilege and crushing responsibility. "Of course I'll coordinate your care," she said, "but I want you to understand something. This time has to be different." "Different how?" "With Robert, I tried to do everything myself. I thought if I just learned enough, worked hard enough, cared, Enough! I could somehow will him back to health. It nearly destroyed me, and it didn't save him. She met his eyes steadily. This time, we build a real support team. Dr. Chen, other nurses, your daughter when she visits, friends from church. We don't face this alone. Harold nodded slowly. I can live with that arrangement. Good, Marianne said, standing to leave, because whether you like it or not, you're going to have more help than you know what to do with. This is Millbrook. Harold, when one of our own is fighting, we all fight. As she drove home through the gathering dusk, Marianne felt something she hadn't experienced in 20 years. The cautious stirring of hope that maybe, just maybe, this time could have a different ending. 3 weeks into Harold's treatment regimen, Marianne established a routine that felt both familiar and entirely different from her experience with Robert. Every Tuesday and Friday, she stopped by Harold's house after work to check his vital signs, review his medication schedule, and monitor the progression of his symptoms. But unlike the isolated vigil she'd maintained 20 years ago, these visits were part of a coordinated care plan that included Dr. Chen, a visiting nurse from the county health department, and Jennifer, who drove up from Des Moines every other weekend. The difference was immediately apparent in Harold's response to treatment. Where Robert had seemed to diminish from the very beginning, growing thinner and more fragile with each passing week, Harold showed periods of stability that gave everyone cautious reason for optimism. The new immunosuppressive protocol was harsh. He suffered from nausea, fatigue, and increased susceptibility to infections, but the rash had stopped spreading, and his inflammatory markers had decreased significantly. "You look better," Marianne told him during a Friday evening visit in early November. She was taking his blood pressure while he sat in his favorite recliner, a worn leather chair that had probably been in the same spot for 20 years. "I feel marginally less terrible than last week," Harold replied, with the dry humor that had helped him through his wife's illness, and now seemed to be serving him well again. "Dr. Hendricks says that counts as progress." Marianne noted his blood pressure. In the small notebook she'd started carrying, another artifact of this strange journey they were sharing. Unlike Robert's medical journal, which had documented a steady decline, Harold's notebook showed fluctuations that suggested his body was fighting back against the disease. "Jennifer called this morning," Harold continued. "She's bringing that boyfriend up this weekend. Wants me to meet him properly." "That's wonderful. What's his name?" "David something. He's a physical therapist, according to Jennifer. Seems like a good match. She always did like taking care of people." Marianne heard the unspoken worry in his voice. Jennifer was 32, at an age when many women were starting to think seriously about marriage and children. Harold's illness had cast a shadow over those normal life progressions, creating urgency around decisions that might otherwise unfold naturally. "You're worried she's rushing into things because of your diagnosis," Marianne observed. Harold nodded. "I don't want to be the reason she makes choices based on fear instead of love. Ellen and I had 17 good years together before the cancer. I want Jennifer to have 50 good years with whoever she chooses." The mention of Ellen reminded Marianne how much she still didn't know about Harold's life during the years when their paths had diverged. She'd been so focused on her own grief and rebuilding that she'd missed his parallel journey through loss and single parenthood. "Tell me about Ellen," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "I remember visiting you both at the hospital, but I don't think I ever really knew her." Harold's expression softened in the way that suggested he enjoyed talking about his late wife, that her memory was a source of comfort rather than pain. Ellen was the kind of person who made everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. She taught 3rd grade for 15 years, and every one of those kids thought she was specifically put on earth just for them. "How did you meet?" "Church potluck, 1985. She'd moved to Millbrook to take the teaching job, didn't know anyone. I was a widower with a 5-year-old daughter." "Wait," Marianne interrupted. "You were married before Ellen?" Harold looked surprised by her reaction. "You didn't know about Susan? We were married right after high school, had Jennifer when we were 20. Susan died in a car accident when Jennifer was 5. Drunk driver ran a red light in Cedar Rapids. The information hit Marianne with unexpected force. Harold had experienced not one but 2 devastating losses, had buried 2 wives, and raised a daughter largely alone. The resilience that had impressed her during his current medical crisis suddenly made more sense. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea. It was a long time ago, and honestly, if Susan hadn't died, I never would have met Ellen." Strange how life works. Tragedy opens doors you never expected to walk through. Marianne thought about her own unexpected door. Harold's illness, bringing them back together after decades of casual acquaintance, forcing her to confront her unfinished grief while possibly offering both of them a chance at redemption. "Is that how you're thinking about this diagnosis?" she asked. As an unexpected door, Harold considered the question seriously. "Maybe. It certainly brought some clarity about what matters, and it's reconnected me with people I'd lost track of." He looked at her meaningfully. Good people. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the front door. Harold started to get up, but Marianne waved him back into his chair. "I'll get it. You're supposed to be avoiding unnecessary exertion." The woman on Harold's front porch was clearly Jennifer. She had her father's warm brown eyes and practical bearing, but with an energy that suggested she faced challenges head-on, rather than enduring them with stoic patience. "You must be Marianne," Jennifer said, extending her hand. "Dad talks about you constantly. I'm Jennifer Edmonds Chen. Well, still deciding about the name situation." "Chen?" Marianne asked, shaking hands with Harold's daughter. "David's last name. We got engaged last weekend." Jennifer held up her left hand, showing a modest diamond ring. "I know the timing seems weird with Dad's diagnosis and everything, but David pointed out that we'd already been together 3 years, and life doesn't wait for convenient moments." Marianne felt a surge of approval for David, whatever his last name was. Anyone who encouraged Jennifer to embrace happiness despite her father's illness understood something important about living with uncertainty. "Congratulations," Marianne said sincerely. "Your father will be thrilled." "Will he? I've been worried he'll think I'm rushing into things because I'm scared about losing him." The concern in Jennifer's voice was so similar to her father's worry about her that Marianne almost smiled. They were both trying to protect each other from the consequences of love in the face of mortality. "Come inside and tell him yourself," Marianne suggested, "but I think you'll find he's more concerned about your happiness than your timing." As they walked into the living room together, Marianne realized that this moment, a daughter bringing news of her engagement to her sick father, represented exactly the kind of life-affirming event that Harold's treatment was meant to preserve. Not just extending his lifespan, but ensuring he could witness and participate in the milestones that gave life meaning. "Dad," Jennifer said, moving to kiss her father's forehead, "I have some news that I hope will make you happy." Harold looked at the ring on her finger and broke into the first genuinely joyful smile Marianne had seen from him since his diagnosis. "I'm assuming this means David finally worked up the courage to propose." "Actually, I proposed to him," Jennifer admitted with a laugh. "Figured someone in this family should take charge of the situation." "That's my girl," Harold said, pulling her into a hug. "When's the wedding?" "Spring, we're thinking. April or May when the weather's nice, but before you start getting really tired from the treatments." The casual reference to his declining health could have been depressing, but instead it felt like acceptance, an acknowledgement that they would plan around his illness without letting it dictate the substance of their lives. Watching father and daughter together, Marianne felt a complex mixture of emotions. Joy for their happiness, sadness for the shadow that Harold's diagnosis cast over their celebration, and something else, a recognition that love persisted and even flourished in the presence of loss. Jennifer's engagement wasn't happening despite her father's illness. It was happening because life was precious and uncertain, and the people who understood the truth didn't waste time waiting for perfect circumstances. December brought the first serious setback. Marianne arrived for her Tuesday evening visit to find Harold pale and breathless, his temperature elevated, despite the immunosuppressive medications that should have prevented infection. His condition had deteriorated so rapidly that she immediately called Dr. Chen, who met them at the emergency room in Cedar Rapids within an hour. Pneumonia, the ER doctor confirmed after reviewing Harold's chest x-rays. His compromised immune system made him vulnerable to an infection that most people would fight off easily. Harold spent 5 days in the hospital, his first hospitalization since beginning treatment. Marianne found herself falling into familiar patterns from Robert's illness, spending every free moment at his bedside, monitoring his breathing, questioning every decision made by the medical staff. It wasn't until Jennifer arrived from Des Moines and gently but firmly suggested that Marianne take a break that she realized she was recreating the same exhausting vigil that had nearly broken her 20 years earlier. "You can't take care of everyone," Jennifer said, as they sat in the hospital cafeteria over coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Reagan administration. "Dad needs you to be his nurse and advocate, not his martyr." The words stung because they were accurate. Marianne had promised herself that this time would be different, that she would build a support system instead of shouldering everything alone. But the moment Harold's condition worsened, all her good intentions had dissolved into the old familiar panic of feeling solely responsible for keeping someone alive through sheer force of will. "Your father reminds me so much of Robert," Marianne admitted. "Same quiet strength, same tendency to downplay symptoms. I keep expecting the worst because that's what happened before. But this isn't before," Jennifer pointed out. "Dad's responding to treatment that didn't exist when your husband was sick. His pneumonia is already improving with antibiotics. You're borrowing trouble from a different situation." Jennifer was right, but changing 20 years of grief-influenced thinking patterns wasn't something that happened overnight. Marianne had learned to expect loss, to prepare for the worst-case scenario as a way of protecting herself from being blindsided by tragedy. The problem was that this defensive strategy made it difficult to recognize genuine progress when it occurred. Harold was discharged on Saturday morning with oral antibiotics and strict instructions to avoid crowds and practice meticulous hand hygiene. His recovery from the pneumonia was remarkably quick. Within 10 days, his energy levels had returned to pre-infection levels, and his primary symptoms were once again limited to the manageable side effects of his autoimmune treatment. "See," Dr. Chen said during Harold's follow-up appointment, "his immune system is suppressed, but it's not completely non-functional. He fought off a serious infection and bounced back. That's actually a very good sign." But the hospitalization had shaken everyone's confidence in Harold's stability. Jennifer began calling daily instead of twice weekly. David, whom Marianne finally met during a weekend visit, proved to be exactly the kind of steady, practical man who would complement Jennifer's take-charge personality. He was also perceptive enough to recognize that wedding planning might provide a welcome distraction from medical anxiety. "We've been thinking about having the ceremony here in Millbrook," Jennifer mentioned during a January visit. "The Methodist Church, where Dad and Ellen were married. Small reception at the community center." Harold looked pleased but concerned. "Are you sure? I know you were hoping for something larger, more elaborate." "David and I talked about it, and we decided we'd rather have something intimate, where everyone who matters can be comfortable," Jennifer said, glancing meaningfully at her father. "Besides, a spring wedding in Millbrook sounds perfect. All the trees will be blooming. The weather should be nice, and you'll be surrounded by people who've known you your whole life." Marianne recognized the careful calculation behind Jennifer's choice. A wedding planned around Harold's declining energy levels, designed to maximize his ability to participate fully while minimizing the stress on his compromised health. It was both heartbreaking and admirable, the kind of loving adaptation that families made when illness redefined what was possible. "What can I do to help?" Marianne asked. "Actually, we were hoping you'd be willing to do a reading during the ceremony." Jennifer said. Something about love enduring through difficult times. David and I both feel like you understand better than most people what it means to commit to someone, knowing that life doesn't come with guarantees. The request caught Marianne off guard. She'd avoided weddings since Robert's death, finding them too painful a reminder of her own truncated marriage. But Jennifer's invitation felt different, not like an obligation, but like an opportunity to participate in something hopeful. "I'd be honored," she said. Planning the wedding gave Harold a project that engaged his mind while respecting his physical limitations. He threw himself into researching flowers that would be blooming in April, coordinating with the church about accessibility issues, and working with Betty at the clinic, who had appointed herself unofficial wedding coordinator, to compile a guest list that included half the town. "He's happier than I've seen him since his diagnosis," Dr. Chen observed during one of their regular consultations about Harold's care. "There's actually some research suggesting that patients with strong social support and meaningful goals show better treatment responses." Marianne had noticed the improvement as well. Harold's inflammatory markers remained stable, his energy levels were better than they'd been during the autumn, and most remarkably, he'd begun talking about plans beyond the wedding, hoping to see Jennifer's first child, wanting to finish some home improvement projects, even mentioning the possibility of taking a trip to visit his brother in Colorado. It was exactly the kind of forward thinking that had been impossible during Robert's illness, when each day had been focused solely on managing symptoms and preventing further deterioration. The difference wasn't just medical advances, though those were significant. The difference was hope, the belief that Harold's life still contained possibilities worth planning for. But Marianne's nursing experience had taught her to be wary of too much optimism. Autoimmune conditions were unpredictable, and the temporary stability Harold was enjoying could change rapidly. She found herself caught between wanting to share in his hopeful planning and needing to prepare for the possibility that his condition might take a sudden turn for the worse. "You're worried about something," Harold said during a February evening visit. They were looking through wedding photographers' portfolios, but Marianne's distraction was obvious. "I'm always worried about something," she deflected. "It's an occupational hazard of being a nurse. This is different. You've got that look you used to get in high school when Mrs. Patterson assigned a research paper you weren't sure you could finish on time." The accuracy of his observation made her smile despite her concerns. "You remember that?" "I remember a lot of things about those days, including how you always found a way to finish the paper, usually better than anyone else in class." "This isn't a research paper, Harold. I can't control the outcome through hard work and careful preparation." "Maybe not, but you can control how we face whatever comes next. And so far, you've been doing a pretty good job of that." His confidence in her was both touching and terrifying. Marianne had learned the hard way that good intentions and medical knowledge weren't always enough to save the people you cared about. But perhaps Harold was right. Perhaps success wasn't measured only in terms of final outcomes, but in the grace and dignity with which the journey was traveled. The call came on a Thursday morning in early March, 3 weeks before Jennifer's wedding. Marianne was reviewing patient charts when Betty transferred the call from Dr. Hendricks, his voice carrying an excitement she'd never heard from the usually measured specialist. "Mrs. Porter, I need Harold to come to Iowa City immediately. We've had a breakthrough." Marianne's pen stopped moving across the chart in front of her. "A breakthrough? What kind of breakthrough?" "I'd rather explain in person. But I can tell you this. We may have been wrong about Harold's diagnosis." The words didn't make sense. Harold had been responding well to treatment, but the fundamental diagnosis had never been in question. His blood work, symptoms and disease progression all matched the textbook presentation of systemic autoimmune inflammatory syndrome. "Dr. Hendricks, I don't understand. The presentation was identical to my husband's case." "That's exactly the problem," Dr. Hendricks interrupted. "I've been reviewing both cases, and there are subtle differences I initially missed." Harold's inflammatory markers are responding to treatment in a pattern that doesn't match classic SAYS. His genetic testing just came back, and it's revealed something extraordinary. Marianne found herself gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles had turned white. What did the genetic testing show? Harold doesn't have the genetic markers for SAYS. What he has is a newly identified condition that mimics SAYS almost perfectly, but responds to treatment in ways we never thought possible. Mrs. Porter, this isn't a terminal illness. It's a rare autoimmune condition that we may actually be able to cure. The world seemed to tilt sideways around Marianne. She'd spent months preparing herself and Harold for a gradual decline, followed by death within 18 to 24 months. The possibility that he might live, really live, not just survive, was almost too overwhelming to process. "Are you certain?" she managed to ask. "As certain as we can be with a condition that's only been identified in 12 patients worldwide." "But Mrs. Porter, Harold is responding to our experimental treatment protocol beyond our most optimistic projections. His inflammatory markers aren't just stable, they're approaching normal levels." After ending the call, Marianne sat motionless in her office for several minutes, trying to absorb the magnitude of what she'd just learned. Harold wasn't dying. The disease that had claimed Robert's life and haunted her dreams for 20 years wasn't the same condition that Harold was fighting. She called Harold immediately, but there was no answer at his house. A call to Jennifer revealed that Harold had driven to Cedar Rapids for some wedding errands and wouldn't be back until evening. "Is everything okay?" Jennifer asked, detecting something unusual in Marianne's voice. "You sound strange." "I need to talk to your father as soon as he gets home. Have him call me no matter how late." "Marianne, you're scaring me. What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Something might be very, very right, but I don't want to say anything until I've spoken with him." The rest of the day passed in a haze of barely contained emotion. Marianne found herself reviewing everything she thought she knew about Harold's condition, looking for signs she might have missed that his disease was fundamentally different from Robert's. The progression had indeed been different, slower, more responsive to treatment, with periods of genuine improvement rather than simply slower decline. Harold called at 8:30 that evening, his voice tired from the day's activities but cheerful. "Jennifer said you needed to talk to me urgently." "Everything all right?" "Harold, I need you to sit down." "I'm already sitting." "Marianne, what's going on?" She took a deep breath, trying to find words adequate for what she was about to tell him. "Dr. Hendricks called this morning. He wants to see you immediately, tomorrow if possible." "Harold, they think you may not have the same condition Robert had." There was silence on the other end of the line for several seconds. "What do you mean?" "The genetic testing came back. You don't have the markers for SAYS. What you have is a different condition entirely, one that mimics the symptoms, but may actually be treatable, possibly curable." "Curable?" Harold's voice was barely a whisper. "That's what Dr. Hendricks said. You're only the 12th person they've identified with this condition, but the treatment responses have been remarkable." Another long silence, then Harold said, "I don't know how to process that information." "Neither do I," Marianne admitted. "I've been sitting here for 10 hours trying to wrap my mind around it. If this is true, if I'm not dying, everything changes. Everything. Jennifer's wedding, her plans to move closer to home, all the careful arrangements we've made, assuming I had limited time." "Harold," Marianne interrupted gently, "those arrangements were made with love, and they're still right regardless of your prognosis. Jennifer wants to be closer to you, whether you're sick or healthy. The wedding is in 3 weeks, and it's going to be beautiful. Nothing has to change except your expectations for the future." But even as she said it, Marianne knew that everything had already changed. The careful emotional equilibrium she'd maintained throughout Harold's illness, preparing for loss while hoping for time, had been shattered by the possibility that loss might not be inevitable. That night, she found herself unable to sleep, her mind racing through the implications of Harold's revised diagnosis. If he was going to live, if he was going to recover, what did that mean for the relationship that had developed between them over the past months? Their reconnection had been forged in the crucible of shared experience with serious illness, built on the understanding that time was precious because it was limited. She got up at midnight and made herself tea, then sat at her kitchen table with Robert's medical journal open in front of her. Reading his entries from 20 years ago with the knowledge that Harold's story might have a different ending felt like examining artifacts from another lifetime. Day 127, Robert had written in increasingly shaky handwriting. Marianne thinks, I don't notice how scared she is, but I see it in her eyes every morning. I wish I could tell her that it's okay, that 18 years of marriage was worth whatever time we have left. I hope someday she finds someone who makes her remember how to be happy. The passage hit her with unexpected force. She'd read it before, many times over the years, but tonight it felt like a message from Robert about Harold. Permission to embrace the possibility of happiness without guilt. Encouragement to see Harold's recovery not as betrayal of Robert's memory, but as fulfillment of his hopes for her future. The next morning, Marianne called in sick for the first time in 3 years and drove Harold to Iowa City for his appointment with Dr. Hendricks. The specialist's excitement was infectious as he explained Harold's condition, a newly identified autoimmune disorder that had been misdiagnosed as SIDS for decades because of its similar presentation. The key difference is in how the condition responds to immunosuppressive therapy, Dr. Hendricks explained, showing them comparative charts on his computer screen. Classic SAIS patients show temporary stabilization followed by inevitable progression. Patients with this new condition, we're calling it mimetic autoimmune syndrome, can achieve complete remission with aggressive early treatment. Complete remission? Harold asked, his voice carefully controlled. Complete remission. No symptoms, normal life expectancy, the ability to discontinue treatment after 18 to 24 months of therapy. Harold looked at Marianne, his eyes bright with unshed tears. No symptoms. The rashes will fade completely. Your energy levels will return to normal. Your immune system will reset itself to healthy function. Dr. Hendricks smiled at both of them. Harold, barring any other health issues, you should expect to live a normal lifespan. You're going to see your grandchildren grow up. Walking out of the medical center that afternoon, Harold stopped in the parking lot and turned to face Marianne. I don't know how to thank you. For what? For recognizing that something was wrong in the first place. For pushing for early diagnosis and aggressive treatment. For coordinating my care and making sure I didn't face this alone. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. For giving me my life back. Marianne felt tears she'd been holding back all day finally spill over. Harold, you gave me something back too. You gave me the chance to help save someone I care about. You gave me the chance to get it right this time. They stood together in the hospital parking lot, two people in their 60s who had lived through losses that might have broken them, now facing the unexpected gift of more time together. The future, which had seemed so carefully circumscribed by illness and limitation, suddenly stretched ahead of them, full of possibilities they were only beginning to imagine. The weeks leading up to Jennifer's wedding took on a surreal quality, as if the entire town of Millbrook was celebrating not just a marriage, but Harold's miraculous reprieve from death. News of his revised diagnosis spread through the community, with the speed that only small towns could achieve, transforming what had been planned as a bittersweet ceremony into an occasion of pure joy. Marianne found herself struggling to adjust to the dramatic shift in circumstances. For months, she'd been mentally and emotionally preparing for Harold's decline and eventual death, building careful psychological defenses against another devastating loss. Now, faced with the prospect that Harold would not only survive, but thrive, she discovered that hope was almost as difficult to process as grief. You seem troubled, Dr. Chen observed during a quiet moment at the clinic. I would have expected you to be celebrating Harold's good news. I am celebrating, Marianne replied. But even as she said it, she knew her response lacked conviction. I suppose I'm just having trouble believing it's real. 20 years of expecting the worst doesn't change overnight, Sarah said gently. You've trained yourself to prepare for loss as a way of surviving it. Now you have to learn how to prepare for life instead. The insight was uncomfortably accurate. Marianne had become so adept at emotional self-protection that she'd forgotten how to be vulnerable to happiness. The possibility of a future with Harold, not as his nurse managing his dying, but as something more complex and hopeful, was terrifying in ways that his terminal diagnosis had never been. 2 weeks before the wedding, Marianne received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Hendricks. His voice carried a note of caution that immediately put her on alert. Mrs. Porter, I wanted to update you on Harold's latest blood work. His response to treatment continues to be excellent, but we've identified something in his genetic profile that we need to discuss. Marianne's stomach clenched with familiar anxiety. What kind of something? The gene variant that causes his condition appears to have a hereditary component we didn't initially recognize. It's possible that Jennifer could be carrying the same genetic markers. The implications hit Marianne immediately. Jennifer, who was getting married in 2 weeks, who was planning to start a family, who had just reclaimed her future from the shadow of her father's illness, might be carrying the genetic predisposition for the same condition. How possible? Marianne asked. There's a 50% chance she inherited the variant from Harold. If she did, it doesn't mean she'll definitely develop the condition, but her children would be at risk, and she should be monitored carefully for early symptoms. Does Harold know? I wanted to speak with you first, given your role in coordinating his care. This is delicate information to deliver so close to the wedding. Marianne understood the dilemma. Jennifer deserved to know about the potential genetic risk, but the timing was problematic. Learning that she might carry the gene for her father's condition just days before her wedding could cast a shadow over what should be the happiest day of her life. I think we should tell them both together, Marianne said after considering the options. Jennifer is a nurse practitioner. She'll understand the medical implications, and she's going to want Harold's support as she processes the information. Can you arrange a meeting? I'd prefer to explain the genetics in person rather than over the phone. That evening, Marianne drove to Harold's house with a heavy heart. He was in his backyard, planting flowers in the garden bed that had been neglected during the worst months of his illness. The sight of him planning for a future he would live to see should have been purely joyful, but the news she carried complicated everything. Harold, we need to talk, she said, settling into one of the lawn chairs he'd placed near his garden. He looked up from the marigold seedlings he was transplanting, immediately recognizing the seriousness in her tone. What's wrong? Marianne explained Dr. Hendricks's call, watching Harold's expression shift from confusion to understanding, to worry, as he grasped the implications for Jennifer. She needs to know, he said finally. But God, the timing is terrible. Dr. Hendricks wants to meet with both of you tomorrow. Jennifer should hear this from a genetic specialist, not from us. Harold sat back on his heels, dirt still clinging to his gardening gloves. What if she decides to cancel the wedding? What if she's afraid to have children? Harold, Jennifer has spent the last 6 months planning her wedding while believing her father was dying. She's not going to be derailed by the possibility that she might carry a gene for a treatable condition. But even as she said it, Marianne worried about the psychological impact. Jennifer had already lived through losing her mother and facing her father's apparent terminal diagnosis. Learning that she might carry genetic risks for her own future children could feel like too much to process. The meeting with Dr. Hendricks took place the next afternoon in his office at the University of Iowa. Jennifer sat between Harold and David, her professional composure intact, but her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The genetic variant your father carries is inherited, Doctor Hendricks explained, showing them a simplified diagram of chromosomes and gene locations. There's a 50% chance you received the same variant from him. And if I did? Jennifer asked, her voice steady. It doesn't mean you'll develop the condition, Many people carry genetic predispositions that never manifest as disease, but it does mean we should monitor you carefully, and it's information you'd want to have if you're planning to have children. David reached for Jennifer's hand. What would monitoring involve? Annual blood work, awareness of early symptoms, immediate medical attention if any concerning signs develop. The advantage Jennifer would have over previous generations is that we now know what to look for and how to treat it aggressively from the beginning. Jennifer was quiet for several minutes, processing the information with the clinical objectivity her training had given her. Finally, she looked at her father. Dad, when you were first diagnosed, did you ever regret having me? Did you worry that you'd pass something dangerous to me? Harold's eyes filled with tears. Never, not for 1 second. Having you was the best thing I ever did, regardless of any genetic risks. Then we're in agreement, Jennifer said firmly. David and I want children. We'll deal with whatever genetic risks exist, just like every other family deals with their particular challenges. The wedding is still on? Harold asked, relief evident in his voice. Jennifer smiled at him with gentle exasperation. Dad, I'm marrying David because I love him and want to spend my life with him. A theoretical genetic risk isn't going to change that any more than your actual illness did. Driving back to Millbrook. That afternoon, Marianne reflected on Jennifer's mature response to potentially life-altering information. The young woman had demonstrated the same quiet strength her father possessed, the ability to face uncertainty without being paralyzed by it. But the revelation about genetic risks had forced Marianne to confront questions she'd been avoiding since Harold's diagnosis was revised. If Harold was going to live, if their relationship was going to continue beyond the crisis that had brought them together, what exactly was she prepared for? She'd told herself for months that she was simply Harold's nurse and friend, coordinating his care out of professional obligation and personal affection. But watching him plant flowers for a future he would live to see, witnessing his joy at Jennifer's engagement, sharing his relief at his improved prognosis. Somewhere along the way, her feelings had evolved into something deeper and more complex. The wedding was now only a week away. Harold's health was stable and improving. Jennifer's genetic testing could wait until after the honeymoon. For the first time since his diagnosis, all the immediate crises had been resolved, leaving space for other questions to emerge. That evening, Marianne found herself standing in her bedroom, looking at the wedding dress she'd worn 44 years ago when she married Robert. She'd kept it in the back of her closet, wrapped in tissue paper and preserved more out of sentiment than any practical expectation that she'd ever wear it again. She was 62 years old. Harold was 64. They were both widowed, both shaped by losses that had taught them the fragility of happiness and the importance of not wasting time. The wedding dress would never fit again, and even if it did, it belonged to a different woman from a different lifetime. But the possibility of love, mature, careful, precious, because of everything they'd both survived, that was something worth considering. She closed the closet door and walked to her kitchen, where Robert's medical journal still sat on the table where she'd left it weeks ago. Opening to the passage she'd read the night of Harold's revised diagnosis, she reread Robert's words about hoping she would someday find someone who made her remember how to be happy. The journal had served its purpose, helping her understand Harold's condition and eventually recognize that his situation was different from Robert's. But perhaps it was time to put it away, to stop defining her present by the grief of her past. Jennifer's wedding was in 7 days. Harold's recovery was progressing beautifully, and Marianne was beginning to understand that the biggest challenge she faced wasn't managing medical crises or coordinating care plans. The biggest challenge was learning how to embrace the possibility of a future she'd never allowed herself to imagine. The morning of Jennifer's wedding dawned clear and warm, with the kind of perfect April weather that made even skeptics believe in divine intervention. Marianne arrived at the Methodist church at 8 o'clock to help with final preparations, carrying the reading she'd chosen for the ceremony, a passage from Corinthians about love being patient and kind, enduring all things. She'd practiced the reading dozens of times, but this morning her hands trembled slightly as she reviewed the familiar words. Standing before Harold's family and friends to speak about enduring love felt like making a public declaration about feelings she was still learning to acknowledge privately. "You look beautiful," Harold said, appearing beside her in the church's small preparation room. He was wearing a navy blue suit that brought out his eyes, and for a moment Marianne could see the young man she'd known in high school, confident, kind, quietly handsome in the way that improved with age. "Thank you," she managed, acutely aware of how carefully she'd chosen her own dress, a soft blue that Robert had always said was her best color, elegant but not attention-seeking, appropriate for a woman her age who was trying to navigate unfamiliar territory. "Are you nervous about the reading?" Harold asked, settling into the chair beside her. "A little." She didn't mention that her nervousness had more to do with his presence than with public speaking. "How are you feeling?" "Not too tired. I feel better than I have in months," Harold said, and she could see that it was true. His color was good, his breathing easy, his energy level clearly improved. The combination of effective treatment and the lifting of his death sentence had worked a remarkable transformation. "Marianne, I wanted to talk to you about something." Before he could continue, Jennifer burst through the door in her wedding. A dress, radiant with excitement and just frazzled enough to seem human. "Dad, the photographer wants family pictures in 10 minutes, and David's boutonniere is crooked, and I think I'm going to throw up from nerves." She stopped, looking from her father to Marianne. "Am I interrupting something important?" "Nothing that can't wait," Harold said, standing to embrace his daughter. "You look absolutely perfect." "I look like I'm about to faint," Jennifer corrected, but she was smiling as she said it. Marianne helped adjust Jennifer's veil while Harold fussed with his tie, and for a moment they felt like a family preparing for a celebration rather than a nurse and patient who had become something more complicated. The ceremony itself was simple and beautiful, exactly what Jennifer and David had wanted. The church was filled with 3 generations of Millbrook residents, all of whom had watched Jennifer grow up and who were genuinely happy to see her find love. When Marianne rose to give her reading, she felt the warmth of community support surrounding her. "Love is patient, love is kind," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. As she spoke the familiar words about love bearing all things, believing all things, hoping all things, she found herself looking directly at Harold, who was watching her with an expression of such tenderness that she nearly forgot the rest of the passage. "Love never ends," she concluded, the words carrying weight beyond their biblical context. The reception at the community center was exactly the kind of celebration Millbrook did best. Potluck elegance with dishes that represented decades of church cookbook favorites, a local band that played music spanning 6 decades, and an atmosphere of genuine joy that made everyone feel like extended family. Marianne found herself assigned to the table with Harold, Dr. Chen and her husband, and several other longtime community members. The conversation flowed easily between wedding gossip, updates on local news, and good-natured teasing about Harold's dramatic recovery. "You know," said Margaret Kowalski, Betty's sister-in-law, "Harold, you're looking so good these days that all the single ladies in town are going to start paying attention again." Harold smiled politely, but his eyes found Marianne's across the table. "I think I'm a little old to be playing the field, Margaret." "Nonsense. 64 is the new 50. Isn't that right, Marianne?" Marianne felt heat rise in her cheeks at being drawn into the conversation. "I think Harold's more focused on enjoying his health than on romance." "Well, he shouldn't wait too long," Margaret continued with the persistence of someone who'd appointed herself the town's unofficial matchmaker. "Good men don't stay single forever, especially ones who've proven they know how to be good husbands." The comment hung in the air, loaded with implications that everyone at the table understood. Marianne excused herself to help with serving the cake, needing a moment to collect herself away from Harold's gaze and the well-meaning speculation of their neighbors. She was cutting pieces of Jennifer's 3-layer vanilla cake when Harold appeared beside her. "Can I help?" he asked. "I've got it under control," she replied, focusing intently on creating perfectly uniform slices. "Marianne." Harold's voice was quiet, meant only for her ears, despite the bustling activity around them. "We need to finish that conversation we started this morning. Harold, this is your daughter's wedding. Whatever you want to discuss can wait until—" "It's been waiting for months already," he interrupted gently. "And I'm tired of pretending that what's happening between us is just about my medical care." Marianne's knife paused halfway through a slice of cake. Around them, the reception continued. Laughter, conversation, the clinking of silverware against china. But she felt as if she and Harold were suddenly alone, in a bubble of charged silence. "What are you saying?" she asked, still not looking at him directly. "I'm saying that somewhere between that first appointment and today, I fell in love. With you, Marianne Porter, and I hope that maybe you feel something similar." Marianne's hands stilled completely, the cake knife suspended in mid-air as Harold's words settled between them. Around them, the wedding reception continued in joyful chaos, but she felt as if time had stopped, crystallizing this moment into something that would define everything that came after. "Harold," she whispered, finally meeting his eyes, "you don't know what you're asking." "I know exactly what I'm asking," he said quietly, moving closer so their conversation remained private, despite the crowded room. "I'm asking if you're willing to take a chance on something neither of us expected. I'm 62 years old. I've been widowed for 20 years. I don't know how to—" She stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was suggesting. "Neither." "Oh, do I?" Harold admitted. "I lost 2 wives, raised a daughter alone, and spent the last 6 months preparing to die. But here we are, both still alive, both still capable of feeling something we thought was behind us." Marianne looked around the room, taking in the celebration surrounding them. Jennifer was dancing with David, her face radiant with happiness. Dr. Chen was laughing at something her husband had whispered in her ear. Betty was organizing the gift table with military precision. This was life continuing, love flourishing, people choosing joy despite all the reasons the world gave them. "To be cautious. I'm scared," she admitted, the honesty feeling both terrifying and liberating. "So am I," Harold said. "But I'm more scared of wasting whatever time we have left by being too afraid to try." Before Marianne could respond, Jennifer appeared beside them, slightly breathless from dancing. "Are you two going to stand here talking all night? Or is someone going to ask Marianne to dance?" she demanded with the authority of a bride who expected her wishes to be granted without question. Harold smiled at his daughter, then turned to Marianne with a formal little bow that was both ridiculous and charming. "Marianne Porter, would you do me the honor of dancing with me?" The band was playing "The Way You Look Tonight," a song old enough to be familiar to everyone in the room, but romantic enough to make the invitation feel significant. Marianne looked at Harold's outstretched hand, the same hand she'd held during medical appointments, monitored for pulse and temperature, watched grow steady again as his health improved. "Yes," she said, placing her hand in his. Harold led her to the small dance floor that had been created by pushing back tables in the center of the community center. Other couples were dancing: Jennifer and David, Dr. Chen and her husband, several other married pairs from the community. But as Harold's arms came around her, Marianne felt as if they were the only 2 people in the room. "You know," Harold said as they swayed to the music, "we never did get to finish that dance from senior prom. You left early because your date got sick. You remember that?" Marianne asked, surprised by the detail. "I remember being disappointed that I didn't get to dance with you. I'd been working up the courage to ask you all evening. Why didn't you ever say anything? We had classes together, saw each other around town after graduation." Harold was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Timing, I suppose. When we were young, I was too shy. Later, we were both married to other people, raising families, living separate lives. By the time we were both widowed, I figured too much time had passed. And now? Now I've learned that time is too precious to waste on regret. Harold's arms tightened slightly around her. Marianne, I know this is complicated. I know we both carry history that makes this feel risky. But when I thought I was dying, one of my biggest regrets was not telling you how I felt. The song was ending, but neither of them made a move to separate. Around them, other couples were changing partners or heading back to their tables. But Marianne found herself reluctant to leave the safety of Harold's arms. "What are you asking of me?" she said finally. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to have dinner with me next Friday. Not as my nurse, not as someone coordinating my medical care, but as a woman I'm hoping to court properly." The old-fashioned word court made her smile despite her nervousness. Court? We're both too old for casual dating, don't you think? If we're going to do this, we should do it right. Marianne thought about Robert's wedding ring, still hanging around her neck beneath her dress. She thought about the 20 years she'd spent defining herself as a widow, building her identity around loss and professional competence. She thought about Jennifer's radiant face as she danced with her new husband, choosing love despite genetic risks and uncertain futures. "Yes," she said, the word coming out stronger and more certain than she'd expected. "Yes, Harold, I'd like to have dinner with you." Harold's smile was brilliant, transforming his face in a way that made him look 10 years younger. "Really? Really, but I have conditions. Name them. We take this slowly. We don't make any decisions based on fear. Not fear of being hurt, not fear of what other people will think, not fear of dishonoring our first marriages. And we promise to be honest with each other, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult," Harold agreed. As the band began playing the next song, they remained on the dance floor, both of them understanding that they'd just crossed a threshold from which there would be no returning. Around them, Jennifer's wedding celebration continued, but for Marianne and Harold, the evening had become something else entirely, the beginning of a story they'd never expected to write. 6 months later, Marianne stood in the same Methodist church where Jennifer and David had been married, but this time she was wearing a simple cream-colored dress and holding a bouquet of late-season roses from Harold's garden. The congregation was smaller than it had been for Jennifer's wedding, perhaps 50 people, mostly longtime friends and Harold's extended family, but the sense of joy and celebration was no less profound. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Williams began, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Harold Edmonds and Marianne Porter, two people who have found love in the autumn of their lives and chosen to embrace it with courage and grace." Marianne looked at Harold, resplendent in a charcoal-grey suit, his color robust and his eyes bright with health and happiness. His latest blood work had shown complete remission, no signs of inflammation, his immune system functioning normally, the experimental treatment having achieved everything Dr. Hendricks had hoped for and more. The past 6 months had been a careful courtship, exactly as Harold had promised. Dinner dates that gradually extended into entire evenings, spent talking on his front porch. Sunday drives through the Iowa countryside, discovering small towns and antique shops they'd never noticed. During their separate lives, quiet moments at the clinic, where their professional relationship had evolved to accommodate their personal connection without compromising either. Jennifer had been delighted by their relationship, confessing that she'd been hoping for exactly this outcome since the day she'd met Marianne. "Dad deserves to be happy," she'd said simply, "and you deserve to be happy too." The genetic testing had revealed that Jennifer did carry the variant for mimetic autoimmune syndrome, but as Dr. Hendricks had predicted, knowledge was power. She would be monitored carefully, and any children she had would be tested early and watched for symptoms that could be treated aggressively from the first sign of trouble. "Harold," Pastor Williams continued, Do you take Marianne to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live? I do, Harold said, his voice strong and certain. Marianne, do you take Harold to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live? The familiar words carried extra weight for two people who had already experienced the worse and sickness parts of those vows. They understood exactly what they were promising each other, and they were making the commitment anyway. I do, Marianne said, meaning it completely. They had chosen not to exchange personal vows, feeling that their promises to each other had already been made in quieter moments, during Harold's recovery, through family celebrations, in the gradual building of trust that had transformed friendship into love. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Harold's kiss was gentle and warm, full of promise for the future they would now share. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers, but Marianne heard only the sound of her own heart, steady and strong, and no longer guarded against the possibility of loss. The reception was held at Harold's house, their house now, in the backyard where he'd planted flowers during his recovery. Long tables covered with white cloths held potluck dishes that represented decades of community recipes, and strings of lights created a magical atmosphere as afternoon faded into evening. Dr. Chen offered a toast that had everyone laughing and crying simultaneously to Harold and Marianne, who proved that the best medical treatment is sometimes a combination of clinical expertise, community support, and the healing power of love. Betty, now officially retired but still the unofficial coordinator of every major event in Millbrook, had outdone herself with the wedding cake. 3 layers of Harold's favorite carrot cake with cream cheese frosting, decorated with fresh flowers from his garden. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Marianne found herself standing by the flower bed where Harold had been working the day she'd delivered the news about his genetic testing results. The marigolds he'd planted that spring had grown into a riot of orange and yellow blooms, evidence of his faith in a future he would live to see. "Any regrets?" Harold asked, appearing beside her with 2 cups of coffee. "About marrying you?" "None." Marianne accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that Harold had remembered exactly how she liked it. Cream, no sugar. "About waiting so long to get married again?" "Maybe a few. We married exactly when we were supposed to," Harold said, with the certainty of someone who had learned to trust life's timing. "If we'd tried this even 5 years ago, we wouldn't have been ready. We needed to become the people we are now before we could build something together." Marianne thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, Harold's illness, her confrontation with grief and guilt, the slow rebuilding of trust in happiness. None of it had been easy, but all of it had been necessary. "I put Robert's medical journal away last week," she said quietly. 20 years of carrying it around, and I finally put it in the storage closet where it belongs. How did that feel? Like letting go of something I'd been holding too tightly. She turned to face him fully. "I loved Robert, I always will, but I'm ready to love you too, without reservation or guilt or the fear that happiness is somehow temporary." Harold sat down, his coffee, and pulled her into his arms. "Everything is temporary, Marianne. That's what makes it precious." As they stood together in the garden Harold had planted during his recovery, surrounded by the evidence of life, continuing and flourishing despite uncertainty, Marianne understood that this was what healing looked like. Not the absence of scars, but the willingness to remain open to joy despite having experienced loss. Not the promise of forever, but the courage to embrace whatever time they had together. The future stretched ahead of them, unknown, unguaranteed, but full of possibilities. They were finally ready to explore together,